This video is about how agency and communion can be found everywhere in the social sciences and philosophy when people organize and categorize the higher order dimensions of human behavior. Agency and communion or something like them tend to emerge. This is why Jerry Wiggins called agency and communion propedeutic metaconcepts. Propedeutic is a word that means introduction, like if you take an introductory course. So what he meant by that is that agency and communion are like the introduction to understanding many different kinds of or levels of human behavior. The first I in contemporary integrative interpersonal theory is integrative, and this is one of the main ways in which interpersonal theory is integrative because you can find the core dimensions of interpersonal theory wherever you look. One example is David Bakan's work on agency and communion. David Bakan was a philosopher, and he had the idea that people have these two worldviews, and they vary according to how important these worldviews are. Agency is about having power and status and having control. Communion is about connection and living together. One of the most important concepts from his work is that either one of these dimensions can mitigate the other. And for an effective society, it's important that that happens. So a society that is only based on agency, power, and force and control is going to be unkind. It's not going to treat its own people well. It's going to cause conflicts with other societies. On the other hand, a society that's only organized around communion, getting along, being communal, being friendly, is not going to progress in ways that a society needs to progress in order to be effective. So for him, there's a connection between individual variation and agency and communion and how well-functioning a society is. Harry Stack Sullivan was the founder of interpersonal theory, and like many other people, including Bob Hogan and Dan McAdams, he organized the underlying needs or motives that drive behavior around agency and communion. So Hogan used the terms getting ahead and getting along for these drives. And of course, in interpersonal theory, one of the core assumptions is that the reason that we do the things that we do is in order to meet these motives. And whereas frustrated motives can be one of the main sources of psychopathology and dysfunction and distress. And so underlying most of our individual interpersonal behavior from a Sullivanian perspective and from many other perspectives are these underlying needs or motives to get ahead and get along. Erik Erikson claims that when he asked Sigmund Freud how you know if somebody is healthy, Freud responded, if a person can work and a person can love, then they're probably doing okay. And again, here we see an organization of a really important and fundamental question about mental health around what you can think of as agentic and communal dimensions. Agency, in large part, has to do with going out into the world and being effective as manifested in work. Communion, being able to get along with others, develop intimate relationships as manifest in the ability to love. One of the first things people think about when they think about agency, communion, and interpersonal theory in particular, and interpersonal assessment is dominance and warmth. And of course, a number of measures have been developed to assess dominance and warmth variation as dispositions across situations, within situations. A lot of that traces back to Timothy Leary and the Kaiser work group who developed the interpersonal circumplex, in which they proposed that variation across different kinds of interpersonal behaviors can be summarized with these two core dimensions of dominance and warmth. But this work also extends outside of the interpersonal circle, and that's what Jerry meant when he described the dimensions as propedeutic, right? That you can find agency and communion explicitly in interpersonal theory, but other people who've tried to study other kinds of topics also tend to run across very similar or potentially the same dimensions. One example is the work of Sandra Bem, who is interested in gender. Of course, nowadays it's pretty well established that gender and sex are not the same thing. This was at one time a sort of open question, and Sandra Bem really pushed this question by establishing a model of gender differences in which she distinguished masculinity and femininity. And of course, men can vary in both masculinity and femininity, and women can vary, and people of all sexes and genders can vary across one another. And when you correlate the BEM sex role inventory with measures of interpersonal behavior, agency and masculinity tend to line up, and femininity and communion tend to line up, meaning that these gender roles take the same shape as variation in basic needs, worldviews, and behaviors that are organized around the interpersonal circle. Much earlier than that, Karen Horney developed a model of defense mechanisms in which she said there's more or less three ways that you can deal with anxiety. One thing you can do is to try to get close to other people. You can move toward through dependent or attention-seeking behaviors. Second thing is you can move against in terms of aggressive, callous, manipulative, violent behaviors. And the third thing you can do is withdraw, move away, detach. And again, these three clusters of behavior can be easily plotted on the interpersonal circumplex, where moving toward has to do with communion, moving against cold dominance, moving away cold submission. Another completely different line of research has to do with what people make of others the moment they see them. So Alexander Todorov and others have done studies where they flash images very briefly, less than a second, of like a person's eyes or a person's face. And then they ask people, well, what kind of impression do you have of this person? And when you summarize the different kinds of impressions people can have, they vary in terms of dominance and trust, which again are very close analogs to agency and communion, suggesting that there's something very ingrained in us to immediately scan our social environment to try to figure out how agentic and communion other people are. Recently, Jendi Cundiff and colleagues wrote a paper connecting interpersonal theory with the stereotype model developed by Susan Fisk and colleagues. In that model, the idea is that people stereotype other groups of people based on perceived competence. So how effective is the other group of people, and warmth, how kind and communal are the other group of people. And Jenny makes a very convincing case that these two dimensions from stereotype threat theory bear a very close connection to agency and communion, and thus it would be fruitful to integrate these two theoretical perspectives. Sam Meisel recently did a similar kind of study, but now instead of stereotype theory, parenting style theory. Parenting style researchers have long classified parents as authoritative, authoritarian, or permissive, where authoritative means these are parents who care about their children but are also taking a dominant role. Permissive parents or let their kids do whatever they want, get away with whatever they want, and authoritarian parents are in control, and the main thing is for them to be in control, and they may lack some warmth. And again, like Horney's model defense mechanisms, these three clusters can be easily placed within the interpersonal circumplex. And in fact, Sam made a measure of parenting styles based on the interpersonal circumplex, which demonstrates that these three parenting styles plot readily onto the circular model. Yet another theoretical perspective that can be integrated within a personal theory is attachment theory. Kim Bartholomew and Len Horowitz in the 1990s did a series of studies in which they argued that attachment styles vary in terms of how positively versus negatively you see self and others. So if you see self as positive and others as positive, you tend to be warm dominant. If you see self as negative and others as negative, tend to be cold submissive, etc. Oftentimes, attachment style researchers cluster people into types, like parenting styles or defense mechanism models. And so there's the secure type, which is related to warm dominant behaviors, the anxious type, which is related to submissive or warm submissive behaviors, and the avoidant type, which is related to more cold or cold submissive behaviors. So here again, we see an example of where researchers studying a particular phenomenon, in this case attachment, but it could also be defenses or stereotypes or parenting styles, etc. They develop a model independent of interpersonal theory without thinking about the interpersonal circumplex in the first place. But after that model has been developed, it's very easy to comfortably fit the model within an interpersonal framework, which really demonstrates the point that interpersonal theory is a model organized around fundamental and propedeutic metaconcepts. And this is one of the main reasons that contemporary integrative interpersonal theory is indeed integrative.